Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a turning point where love is forced to face its hardest choice. What happens when a man must choose between the family that raised him and the family he's built? Will he protect his love at all costs, or walk away to keep everything else intact? Stay with me to find out what decision he makes. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The silence in the apartment didn't leave the next day. It stayed. Not loud, not obvious, but present. In everything. The baby woke up early, her soft cries filling the room like they always did. Tieu Lac moved instinctively, lifting her into her arms, gently rocking her back and forth. Everything looked the same room, the same morning light, the same quiet routine. But inside, nothing was the same anymore. The CEO stood near the window, already dressed for work, but he hadn't moved for a while. His phone rested in his hand, untouched. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know how far it would go. "Are you going in today?" Tieu Lac asked softly. He didn't turn. "I have to." A pause. "My father wants to see me." That was enough. No need for more explanation. Tieu Lac lowered her gaze slightly. She understood. Because if his mother already knew, then his father definitely knew too. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "just don't carry it alone." He finally turned, looked at her, at their daughter, at everything he had chosen. "I won't," he said. But deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. The drive to the villa felt heavier than usual. Not tense, not chaotic, just inevitable. When he stepped inside, his father was already waiting. No greeting, no small talk, just presence. "Sit," his father said. The CEO did. A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Then, his father spoke. "I heard everything." Simple, direct. The CEO nodded. "I figured you would." Another pause. "You didn't tell me," his father continued. "I was going to," the CEO replied calmly. His father leaned back slightly, studying him. "That's not the problem," he said. Silence. "The problem is what this means." The CEO didn't interrupt. "Do you understand the position this puts our family in?" his father asked. Here it was. Not anger, not emotion, reputation. "I understand," the CEO said. "Do you?" his father pressed. A pause. "Because from where I'm standing, you're about to bring a scandal into this house." The word hung there, heavy, sharp, scandal. The CEO's jaw tightened slightly. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said. His father didn't respond immediately. "That's not how the world sees it," he said after a moment. And that was the truth. "I'm not marrying the world," the CEO replied. "I'm marrying her." His father exhaled slowly. "You're thinking like a man in love," he said. "Not like someone responsible for everything that comes with your name." The CEO leaned forward slightly. "And you're thinking like everything matters more than people." Silence. The tension didn't explode. It settled. Deeper. His father looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke again. "I supported you," he said quietly, "from the beginning." A pause. "I accepted her." Another pause. "But this..." He shook his head slightly. "This changes things." The CEO didn't move. "Then what do you want me to do?" he asked. Finally, the real question. His father didn't hesitate. "End it." The word landed like a weight. The CEO's expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. "Or," his father continued calmly, "handle it in a way that protects this family." A pause. "The wedding will not happen." Silence. Absolute. The CEO stared at him. "You've already decided," he said. His father met his gaze. "I've already considered everything." A beat. "This is the cleanest way." Clean. The word felt cold. "And what about her?" the CEO asked. "What about my daughter?" His father's expression softened, just slightly. "They will be taken care of," he said. But the CEO shook his head. "That's not the same thing." Silence again, because both of them knew it never was. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, things were already beginning to fall apart. Tieu Lac stood at the doorway, watching. Her mother was packing, quietly, carefully. "Me," she said softly, but her mother didn't stop. "I'm going back," she said. The words were simple, but final. "You don't have to," Xiao Lac began. "I do," her mother replied. She turned, looked at her daughter. "I've seen enough. No anger, no blame, just understanding. This world," she said quietly, "is not ours." Xiao Lac's eyes filled instantly. "That's not true," she whispered. But her mother shook her head. "It doesn't have to be," she said. A pause. "You chose your path." Another pause. "And now, you have to walk it." Xiao Lac stepped forward. "I don't want you to leave like this." Her mother reached out, gently touched her face. "I'm not leaving you," she said softly. Then her eyes moved to the baby. "I'm just going back to where I belong." The room felt smaller, quieter, because deep down, they both knew this wasn't just about distance. It was about something breaking, something that hadn't fully formed yet. When the door closed behind her, the silence returned, heavier than before. Xiao Lac stood there, holding her daughter, not moving, waiting. For him, for an answer, for something that hadn't come yet, and somewhere, between a father's expectation and a man's choice, the CEO sat alone, knowing that whatever he decided next would change everything. The drive back felt longer than any distance he had ever traveled, not because of traffic, not because of the road, but because of the decision waiting at the end of it. The CEO didn't turn on the radio, didn't take any calls, didn't even check his phone. For the first time in a long time, he let everything go quiet. His father's words echoed, ended. "Protect the family. The wedding will not happen." Each sentence, calm, controlled, reasonable, and yet each one felt heavier than anything he had faced before. Because this time, there was no enemy to fight, no problem to solve, only a choice. And every choice came with a cost. When he finally arrived, the apartment looked exactly the same. Lights on, door closed, still. But the moment he stepped inside, he knew. Something had changed. The air felt emptier. "Tieu Lac." No answer. His eyes moved quickly, searching. Then, he saw her, standing near the window, the same place, the same silence. Their daughter was asleep in her arms. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because both of them knew there were no easy words left. "She left," Xiao Lac said first, her voice quiet. The CEO nodded slowly. "I know." A pause. "She didn't say much," Xiao Lac continued. "But I understood." Another pause. "She thinks this is where it ends." The words landed softly, but they cut deep. The CEO took a step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. "What do you think?" he asked. Xiao Lac didn't answer immediately. She looked down at their daughter, then back up at him. "I think," she said slowly, "you shouldn't have to choose." Silence. "But you will," she added, "the truth, simple, unavoidable." The CEO let out a quiet breath. "My father wants the wedding cancelled." There it was, no delay, no softening. Xiao Lac didn't react, not outwardly, but her fingers tightened slightly around the baby. "And you?" she asked. That question was everything. The CEO looked at her, really looked. At the woman who had stood beside him through everything. At the child in her arms. At the life they had already built, without permission, without approval. Then he spoke. I won't cancel it. The words came calm, clear. Tieu Lac blinked, just once. Are you sure? She asked. He nodded. My father gave me a choice, he said, but he already made his decision. A pause. So now, I'm making mine. Silence. Because this time, it wasn't about convincing anyone. It was about standing firm. They might walk away, Tieu Lac said quietly. I know. You might lose everything. I know. Another pause. And if that happens, she asked. The CEO stepped closer, gently placed his hand over hers, over their daughter. Then I'll start over. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. From the beginning, he added. Tieu Lac's eyes filled, not with fear, not with doubt, but with something else. Relief, because this time, he wasn't choosing between them. He was choosing with them. The baby stirred slightly, let out a soft sound, and just like that, the moment softened. Tieu Lac let out a small breath, one she didn't realize she had been holding. We won't have much, she said. The CEO smiled faintly. We already don't. A small pause. But we have enough. She looked at him, then nodded. Because for the first time, enough didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like a choice. That night, they didn't talk much more. They didn't need to, because everything that mattered had already been said somewhere else. Far from the quiet of their apartment, the CEO's father stood alone in his office, a file open on the table, his son's name on it. He closed it slowly, not angry, not disappointed, just thoughtful. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't rebellion, it was something else, something stronger. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if stopping it was even possible. Back at the apartment, the night settled in. The city lights flickered quietly outside. And inside, 3 people sat together. No certainty, no guarantees, just a decision that would change everything. The wedding would go on, but not the way anyone expected. Because this time, it wasn't about tradition or approval. It was about something simpler and far more difficult to break. Choice. In this episode, the CEO faces the most difficult decision of his life. After learning the truth about Tieu Lac's past, his father demands that the wedding be cancelled to protect the family's reputation. At the same time, Tieu Lac's mother quietly returns to the countryside, feeling she no longer belongs in that world. Back at the apartment, silence and uncertainty fill the space as the couple confronts reality. When the CEO returns home, he finally makes his choice. He refuses to cancel the wedding, choosing Tieu Lac and their daughter despite the risk of losing everything. As he stands firm, the balance between love, family, and responsibility begins to shift. The question now is, will this decision bring them closer to happiness or lead to consequences they are not ready to face?